And we're live. Hi everyone, this is Amateur Gamer, and I'll be returning to AG's Old World tutorial series, and we'll be continuing on to tutorial 5, Culture. So culture is conveniently right here between growth and discontent. And like growth, culture will have to fill up to a certain amount, and once your city fills it up, then it will reach a new level. So you have weak, you have developing, you have, I'm trying to remember, strong and legendary. Let me see. I don't have it. Yeah. So weak, developing, strong, and legendary. Those are the 4 levels. And as you can imagine, you need more culture to reach each of the levels. And culture are very important for a number of reasons. There are certain wonders that can only be built in a city with a certain level of culture. Early on, you will have wonders that only requires a weak culture, but then you have developing, then you have strong, and you have legendary. So if you don't meet the culture criteria, you won't be able to compete for wonders, and that is a very dangerous way to play because, well, depending on your victory conditions. If you're going for points victory, double victory, then wonders will matter because wonders do give you victory points, and missing out on those will hurt you tremendously. For example, over here you'll see that wonders is one of the couple of things that will actually give you victory points. Some other ones, developing, strong, legendary. So culture is also important in that aspect, because if you fall behind in those, you're getting less points, and if your opponents are pulling ahead, you're going to have a hard time catching up. So culture is definitely not one of the resources you want to neglect. And in addition to being requirements for various things, it also expands your borders, your city radius. And what happens is, if your opponent have better culture, then suddenly they have more territory to work with. For instance, let's say I have a neighbor somewhere here near the mountains. They settle the city site. I choose to neglect my culture, and their city is developing faster. It will grab more and more and more territory, and maybe I push out, let's say, 1 tile out, and they're able to push back for the rest of it. What will end up happening, as you can imagine, is that during wars, they'll be able to pose a much bigger threat because they have less territory to travel to reach my cities. So as you can imagine, culture is very important. Once you start neglecting it, you will start finding that you have less land to work with. Less land, or less tile in this case is probably more clear. Less tile means less resources you have within your territory, right? Maybe if I grow my city radius, I would have been able to grab the sheep. But because I neglected it, someone else take it, and now they have the sheep. And when they put the pasture on the sheep, they're able to get other resources. And as you can imagine, your neighbors will get stronger, you're becoming weaker, and that just puts you in a worse state. And just like I said earlier about wonders, the same can be said about certain buildings, improvements. So culture is not something you want to neglect. And culture is different from growth in that you don't get any base, right? You don't get base culture. So you will actually have to actively try to get culture. For example, certain improvements, shrines. I'm bringing up shrines because once you research the technology, what is it called? I'm trying to remember. For example, once you research divination, you have shrines. And you have 4 shrines, and for example, that first one, +2 culture per year. Considering that you have 0 base, even that +2 can make a difference. Now, as you can imagine, maybe going from weak to developing, filling it up to 100, 2 is significant. But once you start moving up, it becomes less significant, and you will need other sources of culture in order to eventually turn your cities into legendary culture. And there are also, like growth, there are certain specialist citizens that are able to help give you more culture. And one of the specialists I can think of, maybe I'm wrong, is, no, I'm not wrong, acolytes. So with acolytes, it's interesting, right? You have shrine that could give culture, and then the shrine will unlock acolytes, which you can then get more culture. So certain specialists will give you the culture you need to reach the higher levels faster. And there's also festivals, right? In addition to on completion +20 growth and -20 discontent, you also have add festival, +1 culture per year. And festival is permanent. So if you do a bunch of festivals, not only are you growing your city more, but you're improving your culture, which is pretty nice. And the fact that this is repeatable means that you can do it for quite a bit. But you gotta remember, you have 200 turns. So it's not like you could constantly do this to get the culture. But this is definitely another source where if you have the civics and you need the growth and you need to fight discontent, this is definitely one of those things you can build. And next, there are certain laws that help with culture. And one of them, assuming remember correctly, here, tolerance, right? Town +4 culture. So there are quite a few different sources, and some of them are in your control. Some of them might be, you build festivals, but others are a bit out of your control. For example, wonders are something you can build, and most of them give culture. As you can see, +4, +6, +6, +6. But of course, you're not guaranteed to get these, right? You have to compete with other nations. But if you can get them, it does mean that your capital, which is usually where you build these, because usually your capital should have the most culture. So usually you meet the requirements sooner in your capital, and as a result, you're able to get more culture in your capital. Of course, that's not guaranteed because you're competing with other civilizations. And there are also events, right? There are events that could give you a flat amount, or they could give you a certain amount of culture every turn for X amount of time. And there are also the fact that your scout can sometimes get you more culture. But this method is not that straightforward. I mean, ancient ruins can give you culture, but I guess that's kind of advanced. But there are certain resources where you can actually do something called harvest. Now I'm curious if I could find it here. So what harvest means is that, for instance, if I move my scout onto this resource, so this resource is outside of my territory. And what happens is, if you move on top of it, you have an option that's called harvest. You harvest it, it says plus 22 food, consumes 1 order. Of course, these resources have to be within a certain distance from your capital, otherwise you won't be able to harvest. And there are certain resources. One of them, I think, is incense. Of course, it doesn't show it here. But one of them is incense. Wherever you harvest, it will give you culture to the city. So that's another source of culture. Early game culture. And if you have enough of those resources nearby, you could potentially get to developing culture very quickly. So harvesting is definitely something I will cover in the future. But just know that there's another source of culture very early on. And if I recall correctly, I think each harvest gives you 10 culture. That's 10% of what you need to get to developing. So if you get a couple of those, and what happens is, after harvesting, there's a bit of a cooldown before you can do it again. So if you time it well and do it properly, your city could have developing culture way before your opponents. I wouldn't say way before, but that extra bit of turns can matter, because you gotta remember that certain wonders requires developing, and if you happen to have the resources and you have developing, right? For example, in this case, we have coastal water, and I have the 600 stone, and I'm developing. I'd be able to build it before any of my competition. Now, there are also penalties to your culture, and I believe discontent also has an impact on your culture. It doesn't say so here. Actually, give me a moment. I'm trying to remember. I could be misremembering things, just because I used to play Civ a lot, so there are certain things that I'm confusing between the game. It doesn't say so, but I believe discontent will have a penalty. Maybe it's not a direct penalty. Like, I vaguely remember it does, but the penalty might be indirect, right? Your high discontent affect other aspects of your nation, and those aspects then affect your culture. So culture is definitely not something you want to neglect, and culture is isolated to each of your cities. I guess I should have said that for your growth as well, right? Your growth only applies to the city is that they adjust independently between your cities. So just because your capital is legendary culture, your other cities, if you neglect them, they might only be developing, and that might just not be good enough. So that should just about cover the basics of culture. Culture is very important. It's not something you need to neglect. And conveniently, getting more growth and getting more culture can be achieved from festivals, so that makes festival a pretty good option. But just remember that you might not always be able to do festival because you have 200 turns and it takes 5 turns. So there's definitely a lot of balancing required. But if you neglect culture, your odds of winning the game is just very slim. I wouldn't say impossible. I'm sure someone could prove me wrong. But without good culture developing your cities, you are going to be hindered in a lot of aspects. Anyways, this is the end of this video. Thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you have a good one. Bye.